Bonjour and welcome back to the history of the United States since 1877. In the past section, we focused on the interwar period in the United States, where in the 1920s you had the roaring period of prosperity, followed by the dire moments of the 1930s, the Great Depression. That period was a deeply isolationist era where the United States would have nothing to do with the outside world. This changed a lot during the 1940s and 50s, which will be the focus of this section, where the United States was involved first in World War II, and then the Cold War and the Korean War. So the next section will have a strong international bent. Let's start with World War II, a huge topic that will split in two halves. Today we'll focus on the origins of the conflict and the early fighting, and I'm sorry to tell you, but the bad guys are going to do quite well. But rest assured that in the second half, the good guys will win in the end. So first, the origins of the conflict then. When we asked ourselves the same question for World War I, the answer was kind of mushy, in that various countries were at fault and they acted for a variety of reasons. In World War II, the conflict is a bit easier in that you have two clearly identifiable villains. Let's start with Japan in Asia. And if you're interested in learning more about the topic, I've uploaded a lecture on Meiji Japan, which is something I teach in the world history section of this course, and so you can get the full picture. Here's just kind of the shorter version. Up until the 19th century, Japan was quite archaic. It was still locked in the era of the samurai. But this changed in 1853, where an expedition sent from the United States and headed by Commodore Perry came to Japan and imposed upon Japan a commercial treaty that the Japanese did not want. And Japan, having failed to industrialize, could not quite fight back. This was really a wake-up call in Japan, and so in 1867, a new young emperor of Japan called Meiji, and he gave his name to the whole era, decided to do a crash course in modernization. So he invited foreign experts, developed the steel industry, the shipyard industry, and in just a matter of one generation, Japan went from being in the medieval era with the period of the samurai all the way to the modern era, industrializing. So that was a great success for Japan, and that's part of the reason why Japan is such a modern country today. But it had some negative effects, specifically that Japan went from being the bullied kid on the block to the biggest bully on the block. As it developed its economy, it built up a modern army with battleships and eventually airplanes and tanks, and it was able to attack its weaker neighbors, specifically China, which had failed to industrialize during the same period and was locked in a bitter civil war between nationalists and communists. And so in 1931, Japan attacked the northern part of China, the province known as Manchuria, and then in 1937 opened the war in a big way by attacking all the major cities of the coast of China, specifically Shanghai and Nanking, where Japan committed untold atrocities. So by 1937, you have essentially a major conflict in Asia between Japan and China, and that's the beginning of World War II there. In Europe, the conflict only opened up a couple years later, and there Germany was the main culprit. Germany, as you recall from the lectures on World War I, had lost that conflict and had been forced to sign the Versailles Treaty, and also had been forced to abandon much of its army and navy and air force. The Treaty of Versailles had also created an international institution known as the League of Nations, which is kind of like the UN today, which was intended to keep peace in the future, though the main backer of the League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson, failed to get that treaty ratified in the US Senate, so the US refused to join the League of Nations. So the League of Nations failed in the long run to prevent an outbreak of a second conflict, even more devastating, just 20 years after the first global conflict. Much of the responsibility of that second conflict would lay on the shoulders of this man, Adolf Hitler, who was a veteran of World War I and then became Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Just read his book, Mein Kampf, which he wrote in captivity in the early 1920s. And you understand that his views are dominated by two concepts. The first one would be race, that he would see the world as divided not between nations, like most people do, or between social classes, as communists would, but between races, where near the top would be the beloved Aryan race of the Germanic people, tall and blonde and looking, well, pretty much nothing like he did. and then much lower would be races that he would despise, such as the Slavic race, that's Eastern Europeans, and even more so the Jewish race. And to him, there was no peaceful coexistence possible between the races. They were bound for a great global struggle for world domination. So his goal at that point would be to expand the Aryan race. To do so, he encouraged German women to have more babies, and also he would need a lot of room in Eastern Europe so that he could have land for those farmers to settle. If you look at the map of Europe, you'll notice that the western part of Europe kind of wedges into the Atlantic and there's not that much land available. However, if you look at Eastern Europe, there the expanses are much wider, and that's where he wanted to settle his beloved Aryan farmer. So he demanded that there be some Lebensraum, as he said in German, living room or breathing space. So in his case, he did not want just to get revenge for World War I and revisit the Versailles Treaty and shift the border here and there. He wanted to eradicate neighboring races and destroy neighboring countries to get far, far greater land than Germany had ever controlled. This is something that neighboring countries took a while to understand, because the neighbors, especially France and Britain, initially tried to negotiate with him. This was known as a policy of appeasement, to appease Hitler, a policy that the United States also supported. So what does that mean? It means giving reasonable concessions to Hitler in the hope that this would avert another global conflict, because France, Britain, and most countries in Europe were so traumatized by World War I still, when an entire generation had been wiped out, that they did their best not to get involved into a second conflict. So in 1936, when Hitler wanted to unify Germany with his native Austria, something that he called the Anschluss, the unification, well, he threatened war if he didn't get his way. And even though Britain and France were very worried that Germany plus Austria would turn into a much larger Reich or empire, well, they went along with it to avoid war. Then in 1938, he decided that he wanted a chunk of Czechoslovakia, a country which, aside from being hard to spell, also had a significant German minority in areas not far from Germany, a place called the Sudetenland. And he threatened, once again, that he would start a war if he didn't get his way. And few people in Europe in 1938 were willing to die for the Sudetenland, a place that most of them could not even place on the map. And so at the Munich conference in 1938, France and Britain and Italy agreed to grant the Sudetenland to Germany and pretty much dismember Czechoslovakia against a formal promise by Hitler that this would be the end, that he would then have peace in their time. As it turned out, however, just within a year later, by 1939, Hitler came back and asked for even more land, in that case, Poland, which had some German minorities in there, but by and large was settled by Slavic people, the Poles, and Jewish people. So there's not much justification there except for he wanted land. By that point, the French and British government understood they had been played and decided that they would not give in to those demands, abandon the policy of appeasement. And so when in September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland anyway, France and Britain declared war on him, and that was the beginning of World War II in Europe. Remember that name, the Munich Conference, because that eventually became a big symbol during the Cold War. It was seen as a failure of the appeasement and what happens when you give in to dictators. And so many US policymakers in the Cold War realized that you cannot negotiate with dictators and it's better to be firm early on. So that became kind of the underlying statement for the policy of containment, of holding strong against the Soviets during the Cold War. And so by 1939, you have war in both Asia and Europe, and the United States was involved in neither conflict. Because after World War I, the US had become strongly isolationist, did not want to have anything to do with what was going on in Europe. And specifically in 1935, 36, 37, the US Congress passed a series of neutrality acts. Neutrality simply means to stay out of a conflict. So you pretty much looked at all the reasons why the US had entered World War I in the first place, and you tried to revert that. So what had happened in World War I? Well, the US had loaned money, so that had given a financial incentive for the US to enter the war on the side of France and Britain, just so that it would get its debts paid back. So in 1935, the Congress said that the US banks could not loan money to countries that were at war in Europe to remove that financial incentive. Also in World War I, Germany had sunk a number of ships, such as the famous Lusitania, where American citizens were traveling, and this had put pressure on the US Congress to declare war on Germany. So to prevent that, the Neutrality Act told American citizens do not travel to war zones, do not trade with countries that are at war, and if for any reason you find yourself in a battle zone and you get sunk and you get killed, don't expect the US Congress to declare a war on your behalf. Well, by 1939, the policy started to be shifted a lot of it at the urging of Franklin D. Roosevelt, who, as a young, rich man, had traveled to France, had traveled to Britain, was a bit of a Francophile and an Anglophile, and as such was very, very interested in what was going on in Europe. And that tends to be a rule in American politics, that people who live on the East Coast tend to be far more interested in European affairs, more interventionist, rather the people that live in the Midwest tend to be more isolationist. Franklin D. Roosevelt, having grown up in New York, would be far more interested in affairs in Europe than, say, a senator from, say, Wisconsin or Missouri. So a little by little, he tried to tweak the Neutrality Acts, starting with a policy called cash and carry. By 1939, Britain and France were at war with Germany and trying desperately to buy as many weapons as they could, especially American tanks and airplanes and such, except normally they could not. And so Roosevelt had a policy called cash and carry, whereby he would sell as many weapons as needed, even to belligerent countries, as long as they paid cash and then carried their own war goods. So they would bring destroyers and merchant ships to the coast in the US, load up all the American weapons and carry them across the North Atlantic. So that was a way of tweaking the Neutrality Acts by clearly favoring one side without taking too many risks. Well, by 1940, France was defeated, and so England stood alone against Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union had not quite entered the war yet. And Britain was desperate to have more ships, both to defend the English Channel from a potential German invasion, but also protect all the sea lanes that connected it to North America and its colonies. And for that, you would need small battleships that are known as destroyers. So Britain offered to get some destroyers from the US, so it was running low on cash. They would not be cash and carry in that case. Britain was willing to offer some leasing rights in some of the colonies of Britain where the US Army could build bases and such, in exchange for which the United States would sell something like 50 old World War I era destroyers. So that was presented as a deal and not quite a violation of the Neutrality Act, so clearly by that point the US was leaning towards one side. Fast forward to 1941, Britain was still at war with Germany, but definitely broke back then, and desperately needed weapons. And so to obtain those, it signed an agreement called the Land Lease Agreement with the United States. What that meant was that the US would lend weapons to Britain, meaning that they would get them back afterwards, or lease them, like you would lease a car and buy them on credit, with an option to buy them outright at the end. It was a way to present it as not quite loaning money, though in practice it was loaning money. You don't really lend weapons, it's like chewing gum. Once somebody else has used it, you don't exactly want it back. And it was kind of silly to lend tanks and airplanes to Britain and then let them use it in a war against Germany and expect that 3 or 4 years from now, all these weapons would be back intact in the US arsenal. But that's FDR again, trying to do its utmost to help the British while remaining within the letter of the Neutrality Acts, even though not the spirit of it. And so by 1941, the United States was pretty much involved in the war as a supplier of weapons to one side and one side only, and that would be the British side. And a lot of these weapons are then sent across the Atlantic to Britain, and so technically the US is not at war. Many American ships are given orders to escort those ships in what became known as the Battle of the Atlantic, meaning convoys of merchant ships trying to make it past German submarines all the way to the British Isles. Technically, the US is not at war yet, but American ships happen to be next to the convoys, and when they get attacked by German submarines, they fight back. And so there are people who are dying and drowning in the North Atlantic, and that was a way for FDR to enter the war without quite properly getting congressional authorization for it. So if you had asked Roosevelt as of 1941 which country he really wanted to get into a war with, it would have been Germany, which he absolutely loathed. However, the war really began with Japan, and so let's get back to Asia now. By that point, the United States had identified Japan as a clear villain in East Asia because they were the ones that had invaded China back in 1937. To punish Japan without actually entering into a conflict with Japan, the US imposed economic sanctions, what is called an embargo. An embargo is not quite like a blockade. A blockade would mean that the US Navy would block enemy port and prevent any goods from coming in and out, and that would be an act of war. An embargo means that the US, on its own, will refuse to sell goods to Japan while letting other countries trade if they wanted to. And this would hurt Japan enough that they would have to abandon the war, because without steel and without oil, they could not make tanks or operate their ships and such. Well, the effect was the actual opposite. Japan refused to buckle under. Instead, it just went out and invaded even more places, especially in Southeast Asia, a very rich area of the world where there is plenty of tin and steel and oil. So in 1940-41, Japan took over French Indochina, which is Vietnam today, invaded British Malaysia, Singapore, which were British colonies back then, as well as Indonesia, which used to be a Dutch colony. As they did so, the Japanese empire became quite overextended, and there was a fear that the US might attack it, specifically from the Philippines, which used to be a US colony. Remember, we studied that when we talked about the Spanish-American War over Cuba. And also the US had a major naval base in Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific, from which it could also attack the Japanese empire. So to prevent any kind of American attack, the Japanese decided to do a preemptive strike, where on December 7th of 1941, as you know from all those news reels, Japan attacked the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, and at the same time also began an invasion of the Philippines. And the Americans thought that they could do that without actually starting a war with the United States. I'm not sure how they read the US public. At any rate, the United States then decided to declare war on Japan, and that was the beginning of World War II as far as the US is concerned. So for Franklin D. Roosevelt, it was a bit of an issue, because he had always been preparing for a war with Germany, and now he was at war on the wrong continent in Asia. Adolf Hitler solved that conundrum for him pretty quickly when he decided to also declare war on the United States, and then the US declared war back on Germany as well. Why would Hitler declare war on the US? Well, part of it was an issue of timing. Hitler was after world domination, so he had always planned for a war with the US as well. And if the US was at war with Japan, that seemed like a good time to join in the fun. Also, Hitler always saw the world through the prism of race. And to Hitler, the United States, which was composed partly of African settlers or slaves who had been brought as part of the Atlantic slave trade, and then some Anglo-Saxon settlers and some Germanic immigrants, these would be the good kind in his mind, but also Jewish immigrants and Slavic immigrants and so forth, and all of them had mixed up in what he called a mongrel race, kind of a mutt, if you will. So for that reason, he despised the United States and thought that this was a nation of bookkeepers and businessmen and such who never had the stomach for a fight. So that's the situation by December 41. Now the war was global. Initially, the war went very poorly for the forces of the Allies, as they were called. From the US, Allies would mean Britain, France, so under German occupation by then, and then Russia, which was invaded by Germany in June 41, and so would be an ally of the United States during World War II. The enemies would be referred to as the Axis power, AXIS. That refers to Germany, another fascist dictatorship, Italy, and then Japan. Initially, all these did quite well. I mentioned to you that Germany had attacked Poland in September 1939 and invaded that country. Then in the spring of 1940, it turned against France and defeated that country, as well as the Netherlands and Belgium and Norway and Denmark and plenty of smaller countries. And then in June of 41, turned against Russia and initially did extremely well in the first year of the war. This was due to a new type of warfare called Blitzkrieg, or the lightning war. People had all assumed that World War II would be kind of like World War I, where there would be a lot of bloody fighting that would be quite static and making no progress after years of fighting. But World War II turned out to be quite different, with the appearance of the tank, as well as a radio system that would allow you to connect your troops to your tanks, to air support. Then you could have a rapid penetration of the enemy, and if you moved fast enough and enveloped your enemy, you could prevent being stuck in that kind of static warfare that was the hallmark of World War I. In Asia, you also had some impressive successes by the Axis early in the war. And as I mentioned earlier, initially the Japanese do very well against China, Indonesia, Malaysia, Indochina, and the Philippines, which Japan overtook in 1941-42. The photo that you see now would be the surrender of the US garrison at Corregidor in the Philippines, which was really a photo that went around the world because it went against all the racial prejudices that people at the time. They thought that the Asian armies could never defeat predominantly white armies like the US Army, well, as it happened, the Japanese Imperial Army was quite good early in the war. So bad was the situation that early 1942, the United States decided to mount a raid against Japan, just for the sake of boosting American morale after a long series of defeats. This would be known as the Doolittle Raid after the US Air Force general that mounted the raid, though you could drop an O and say that this is a Doolittle Raid because it did not achieve much. You take a fleet of aircraft, I think these were B-24 bombers, take off from an aircraft carrier, go all the way to Japan, drop a few bombs on Tokyo, not that many, just to make a point, and then after that you don't have enough gas to come back to the aircraft carrier, so you find some place to ditch, either in Japan or in China, and a lot of the crews were lost. So that did not achieve much per se, and in fact had a lot of losses, but on the plus side it means finally we're fighting back against Japan. We have dropped some actual bombs on the capital of Japan, so it was more of a morale booster. So that's it for today as far as why World War II began. In Asia, it's connected to the expansionist policies of Japan, and in Europe to the expansionist policies of Hitler, with the US being dragged into the conflict willy-nilly against its will by the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Before I sign off, however, I would like to draw the lessons from the past and to show how they relate to today's debates for you as US citizens as you prepare to vote. Specifically, the whole debate between interventionists, people who would like the United States to be very involved in world affairs, and isolationist people who, well, want the exact opposite. And we've seen that traditionally the United States had been an isolationist republic focused on development from sea to shining sea, at least in the 18th and 19th centuries. This was true especially in the Midwest, when you're far away from the coast, far away from Europe. We saw that change a bit in Section 2, of course, with the Spanish-American War, whereby the United States acquired territories in Puerto Rico, parts of Cuba, or the Philippines and Hawaii, and then some Caribbean interventions, and then the big involvement in World War I. But there had been a very big backlash against that in the 1920s and 30s, and a return to the more traditional isolationist policies. So what we saw today would be a big change toward a more interventionist attitude that would dominate from roughly 1941 to the present. So how do you explain that change? Well, part of it would be connected to the appeasement policy that we saw today, and specifically the Munich Conference. After 1938, there is a feeling among Americans that to give in to dictators is not a good policy. You will be dragged into a war anyway at a later stage, so it's better to be firm from the get-go. Also, World War II was a long war lasting until 1945, immediately followed by an even longer conflict, the Cold War, which began around 1946 and would last until, well, roughly 1989. So Americans got used for the long run to be involved in one conflict after another, and that whole isolationist attitude kind of faded away. Another major development in modern warfare is that distances have disappeared. It was easy to be isolationist in the 19th century when it took weeks for warships to cross the Atlantic and attack the United States. The US could afford to kind of stay away from conflicts in Europe that were not too threatening to the American continent. By the time of the Cold War, however, you have intercontinental bombers or even intercontinental missiles that can reach the US in a matter of hours or even minutes. So it becomes more difficult to ignore foreign conflicts because, well, the threat is far more imminent. And nowadays, the United States has so ditched its isolationist tradition that it is a very interventionist country that has thousands upon thousands of troops stationed in dozens of countries around the world. And it seems that every year or two or three, the US president goes on TV to announce that he has ordered the bombing of that country or that other. In fact, they don't even bother to declare war anymore, even though the Constitution requires that the Congress declare war. This has not been done since, well, 1941 and the bombing at Pearl Harbor. So what do you think about that? Are you an interventionist at heart who thinks that the United States has a duty to be a superpower and fix all the problems of the world? Or are you more of an isolationist who thinks that this is nobody's business, that other countries should take care of themselves, and that American blood and money should not be wasted on foreign conflicts that will not achieve much? Well, that's for you to decide. As for now, au revoir and goodbye.